Okay, so I just spoke on Press TV about NATO beefing up in the Balkans and the Baltic. What they're saying is in response to Russia saying that they would aim their military at whoever threatens them. But of course, you've seen, I mean, anyone who's halfway awake has seen that it's been NATO that's been pointing the guns at Russia for the last 25 years since the collapse of the USSR. And some people are asking, well, what does the U.S. have to gain from this? And clearly, there's not a whole lot of direct economic benefit in the purely materialist economic sense, because they really, the this is a key thing that it gets absent from so much discussion because we tend to look so much at the present and we're living in the now, and we don't look at these sort of broad questions of history and these broad questions of economic development. What is, and this really begs the question, what is the definition of economic growth? I mean, they use this word so much and they don't really say what it means because they've destroyed the meaning. Economic growth would mean either, and it's really two sides of the same coin, that your buying power would increase or that prices would decrease and decrease. Economic growth, if the economy had really been growing in real terms by 3% every year, whatever they say it is, 2%, 1.5% is a stagnant economy. 3% is normal, 4 or 5% is good, 7% is fantastic. But if that were really true, then basically applying like the rule of 76 or whatever it is, and you use interest rates to see when a number would double, you can see when prices should be cut in half. Because if the economy is growing, then prices should fall. If the economy is growing by 3% every year, then prices should fall by 3% every year, or buying power should increase by 3% every year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you know, in England, there's constant headlines about the economy improving or the stock market rallying. And every month, there's more homeless people on the street. I mean, you've only to use your own five senses.
Right,
And,
right.
and your money isn't going as far as it used to. And,
Right.
and we're reading all these headlines about economic success, you know?
Yeah, it's like Orwell's. I know it's cliche, but it's like 1984. It's like the opposite. It's literally the opposite of truth. And I think that a lot of reporters are just bought off, and the rest of them are,
Well,
silenced. But there's
you,
also economic illiteracy.
you say journalists are bought off. I mean, it's just a fact. There's editorial control, and they're paid a wage, and they need the wage to
Right.
support their family.
And that's so they're telling this lie that the economy is growing. If the economy were growing, prices would drop. That's a fact. Now you can say, well, population is increasing, or you can say other factors. But if you're saying in absolute terms that the economy is growing, that takes into account growing population. That takes into account all other factors. It may be a problem that the population is growing by 80 million people a year. I mean, that's building like 10 new cities every year with 8 million people in them. How do
Well,
you produce goods and services for them?
economy should mean well-being. You know, if the
Yeah,
economy is
yeah.
improving, our well-being is improving.
Well, that's like they used to talk about a happiness index or a satisfaction index, and these were interesting concepts at the time too. And there was even a time in the 90s when there were some like sort of, I don't want to say like on the right side of things, but they were forward looking, that were trying to look at things being interpreted in terms of people's well-being and happiness or quality of life. For example, in Serbia, uh, the average monthly wage is maybe 300 euros a month, right? It's very low by Western European standards. 300, that's about 300 bucks, give or take. But you know what? And unemployment is over half, okay? It's like 50, 60%.
Wow.
But the standard of living is very, very high because people have a very good social psychology and people interact very well. and they know how to go out and look good and feel good without spending a lot of money. They can sit down for 3 hours over a cup of coffee and spend 50 cents or a dollar instead of spending $40 or something on, or $50 on dinner. So they just do things differently, and they have their whole economy arranged differently. Because their population is not growing, there isn't a housing shortage, and people tend to, like, when their grandparents die, their parents move into the grandparents' house, and then the children move into the parents' house. So they kind of rotate the real estate, right? Because the population is stagnant, right? So but their quality of life is very, very high. And there was a scientific study done, and Serbs have like among the highest self-esteem in the world, which is very strange for a country that ranks, I don't know, 50th or 100th in terms of economic well-being. So that says something about what you're saying. But what I'm really concerned about is how you have all of this talk, the United States supposedly put a man on the moon, high tech, the atomic age, robots, automation, free energy, and all this stuff just boiled down to what? I mean, the end of the Cold War, all this stuff was supposed to like bring in this whole new era of prosperity, of increased standard of living.
Yeah.
And none of it happened. I mean, it's all been a big scam.
It is. It's
gotten worse.
You're absolutely right. But also, America's been hijacked and by a clique, a cabal. I mean, I don't think I can't believe any people would be so self-destructive. I mean, I'm in agreement with you, but I think in reality, the country's just been hijacked.
Well, it's been, Andrew Jackson, although he was an Indian killer, also was against the Rothschild Bank and their version of the Federal Reserve. There was like the first charter bank, the second charter bank, first Bank of New York, and so forth. I mean, the fight in the U.S. goes back to the very start. You had some of the first major Supreme Court decisions in the early 1800s revolved around the existence of how much power you delegate to a central bank. I mean, and the thing is that in the Constitution does not talk about the creation of a central bank, but it does say that you produce currency, and it describes some functions of bank. And through the doctrine of implied powers was the Supreme Court ruling that was, I think, 1803 or 1804. One of the people who's more informed can make a comment about it, but it created the legal construct. So it's from the very start. We're talking about from 1789, and then 12 or 14 years later, major Supreme Court ruling completely legalized a central bank and implies that it can be in private hands. Because what a lot of people don't understand is that even in the 1500s and 1600s in England, so much of things were approved by the crown, but they were through private charter. So they were approved by the crown, but through a private charter. And that was very different from the French system of an absolute monarch like Louis the 14th, Louis the 16th, who are absolute monarchs. In England, going back for hundreds of years, some people say, oh, the Magna Carta, so on and so forth, had a decentralized system of allowing what are called privateers, from which the word pirate comes from, and allowing these pirateers, or privateers, if you will, by a charter system to establish basically corporations like the British East Indies Trade Company and so forth. And the first charter Bank of New York, or the first Bank of New York, was one such charter that attempted to print private money, and it created like the foreground, or the precedent for what we have today since 1913 of the Federal Reserve. I mean, these are controlled. I mean, clearly, and it's so crazy to say that you have to like pre-qualify these things, but there's no secret that the Rothschild family and its proxies manage the most powerful controlling share. They might own 30 or 40% of it, but it's the controlling share. And so the thing is that this is a real thing. So I don't think it happened in the last 20 years, brother, is what I'm saying. I mean, this is something that's been going on for some time. Yeah. But I agree with you that it's been hijacked from 1776. But 1789 was one of the first reversals.
Well,
that's just my view. I mean,
no, it's all very legitimate, but it's just overwhelming, the amount of warfare that's ongoing at this recent history. Look,
I would just I would conclude with this. We said if the economy is growing, prices would go down. Well, actually, if the means of production, like if the factories that produce the things that we consume, right, if they did not operate on the basis of commodity production, which means that they make things to break, like planned obsolescence. There was a book written in the 1950s called Planned Obsolescence, where a guy, and it was a pretty mainstream book that actually inspired people like Ralph Nader later on. And this guy proved that companies like General Electric and General Motors were making things to break. They were even using more expensive plastic parts where cheaper parts made from tin that would last longer would have done the trick. But then the machine, like your washer machine or your toaster oven, wouldn't have broken, so you wouldn't go buy a new one. And actually, this has gone before Congress under review, and the justification is that people would not have jobs if things that we buy didn't break, because people go to work to produce things, and then it's a cycle of production and consumption. But what I'm saying is that the future that we were promised is that, like robots and stuff like that, we're going to make these things. And if the economy kept expanding, you actually would have eventually hit a 0 point where things cost no money. And automation and the other access of automation, where robots making things, would increase to the point that people didn't have to do menial work. And in the 1950s and 1960s, this was being promised to Americans and to the West as the future. I mean, this was inspiring, Buckminster Fuller. This was inspiring Walt Disney. This was inspiring even the AFL-CIO wrote, the major trade union in America. They wrote books and sponsored studies about this. Congress used to talk about this, labor relations studies. Harvard, Yale University used to produce, professors used to speak on this, and it all went away. I mean, it all went away. We don't talk about it anymore, and we're living in the cycle where they're trying to like keep us in like a rat turning on a wheel instead of really. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you've raised more questions than answers, but it's like you can't see the wood for the trees. There's a bigger game at play, and we have to wonder for how long we've been given spin. There was this utopia that we all thought we were going for, and
right.
It's had a pin put in it, gone pop.
But I have a question for you. I mean, do you find it strange that they don't make these promises anymore? I mean, there was a time when they were talking about, moon missions and Mars missions and cures for cancer, and now all they talk about is like transgender and war on Russia. I mean, isn't that weird? And what happened to those promises?
Yeah, I think they're still they're on page 2 and page 3. They still exist, the promises. But yes, we're heading for war with Russia and China and Africa, South America. I don't think I've left anything out.
Well, there's also a war on Americans. And
there is in actual fact, there's a war on Americans. The Declaration of Martial Law and all this fighting and killing in the Middle East, it's going to come home to roost. And we haven't cracked their real goals. We haven't really understood what they're all about, what they've been trying to achieve, and that's frightening. That's dangerous. But they could happily turn Americans on each other, shooting each other.
Yeah. I mean, you look at the rivalry between football teams in the U.S. or baseball teams, but especially football teams. I mean, you can see there's like local rivalries that get ugly. I mean, it's like they can turn the switch on and off. You can act like, oh, we're all Americans, tie yellow ribbon, but then you've got, I don't know, the Super Bowl, and suddenly people are ready to kill each other from the other city.
Yeah, I think it might be worse in Europe. Joaquin, this is a good insight you gave us. Nice new topic,
hey, look,
unexplored.
Thanks for letting me talk about it. I know I never touched on that before, and it's something that I think about at times.
Yeah, I haven't heard it elsewhere either.